And the Newsfeed PM Late Edition. Thanks for staying on. British politician Jeremy Corbyn has raised questions over what the United Kingdom's recognition of Palestine means. The UK joined several nations to recognize the Palestinian state. A United Kingdom Member of Parliament spoke to Newzroom Afrika's Iman Rappetti regarding the developments in Gaza.
State of Palestine.
The UK has recently recognised Palestine based on borders of 1969, or 1967, I should say. How meaningful do you think the shift is, given, what we've seen is the ongoing Israeli settlement expansion and the occupation realities on the ground?
I'm obviously pleased that recognition has at last happened. I voted for it more than a decade ago in Parliament on a non-binding resolution, so yes. And it was quite an emotional moment to stand outside the Palestinian embassy exactly a week ago and see the Palestinian flag raised in front of it. That was good. However, and this is a big however, I'm very unclear what Britain is actually recognising. They're recognising Palestine as an entity, but if you recognise it as an entity, then you must challenge the fact that it's under occupation. Gaza under bombardment, the West Bank with attempted annexation of it by the Netanyahu administration, and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, third generation now, in refugee camps in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. So there are huge issues there, but what it will do is force the British government into a direction of more support for Palestine, because it's been a long struggle of the Palestinian campaign in Britain to try and stop arms supplies, which are still going on, and to try and bring about justice through recognition. But the crucial thing is to stop the genocide in Gaza. And
we'll circle back to that. I want to go back into real moves that can change the reality of what's happening in Gaza through governance. Even there was a bill that you had brought for an independent inquiry into the UK involvement in all of this, but that was blocked by your colleagues in the Labour Party. Is there a systemic unwillingness in UK politics to hold itself and others accountable for international law violations?
They don't like being held to account, and British governments do not like the idea that they may be in breach of international law, because they self-congratulate themselves on the fact that Britain helped to write the Universal Declaration, the European Convention, and so on, and therefore they can't possibly be in breach of them. Well, actually they are. And so what I did was proposed a bill in Parliament to set up a Gaza inquiry on a similar lines to the inquiry that Sir John Chilcot headed into the Iraq War. It got through its first stage. It was blocked at its second stage in Parliament. I wasn't terribly surprised by that. And so with our very limited resources, we held a 2-day tribunal at Church House, Westminster, in which we had 29 witnesses, legal, medical, personal, aid, diplomatic, and so on, all gave evidence. We are producing a report on this, but the indications are absolutely the horror story of what's going on in Gaza, and we will give that all the publicity we can, and I'll present it to both the Foreign Office and to the government and demand their reaction.
Mm-hmm. Well, what that does, this tribunal, it accuses your government of complicity in genocide through things like arms supplies and military cooperation with Israel. You talk about this report going to be ready soon, and I imagine it would document that evidence that you said was provided. Can you share what that some of that concrete evidence is that links UK support specifically to war crimes in Gaza? The government, of course, is denying this and standing back.
Many issues. Yeah. The first one is the use of the Royal Air Force Base at Akrotiri and the use of the Royal Air Force Base at Dekalia, both in Cyprus, which have been used to base British planes for overflying of Gaza, where they've taken more than 600 flights, recording a great deal of information. Very unclear where that information is going. When I asked in Parliament if all this information will be shared with the ICJ and the ICC, they said no. When it was asked for by the lawyers representing the family of a deceased aid worker, they felt there was evidence there. That was refused. That's point one. Point two, F-35 jets are having a devastating effect on Gaza, obviously. 15% of the components of them are made in Britain. We've asked for the supply to cease. We've asked for there to be a ban on those parts going to any Israeli-owned jet. The government keeps saying it's a global supply chain, we can't interfere. Yes, they can interfere, and yes, they should interfere. Thirdly, supply of weapons has gone on until very recently, and there was indeed an increase in arms sales from the time that Keir Starmer became Prime Minister, and it eventually only reduced in the latter part of, well, not that long ago, to be quite honest. And so those are a number of areas, and the constant refusal to acknowledge that genocide could be happening. They opposed South Africa taking the case. They said there was no merit in the case. They said you cannot bring this issue. The Foreign Office then did its own investigation and said there is no genocide. They haven't published the details of that. And so there is an argument. But genocide as a statement is important. But more importantly, it's to stop it happening.
When we think about what is happening, the reports on starvation, the availability of very little humanitarian aid reaching people, the catastrophic situations that people are actually finding themselves living in every day. What does that story represent to you from the people that you have been engaging with on this visit, and the reports that are available by independent organizations?
I find all the reports totally terrifying. I heard evidence from Dr. Nick Maynard and from Dr. Victoria Rose, both of whom have been working in Gaza, both of whom are brilliant medical surgeons, but they just describe what it's like to operate on a child with no antiseptic, no anaesthetic, no equipment, no support to try and save life. And yet, all this horror story of under-equipped and bombed hospitals, a few kilometres away, there's all the medicine, all the food, all the water, all the power, everything. It's a deliberate act of withholding supplies and resources, which itself is a war crime for an occupying power, and Israel is an occupying power. And so I think we just have to look at the human side of it. I've been in Gaza on many occasions before this war went on. It's never been good. It's been encircled and so on and so on. Indeed, I was an election observer there more than 20 years ago. But now, what do you see? Devastation all around, and a whole population being sent south, then sent north, then sent east. And what the group Forensic Architects have shown is that the bombing of Gaza City is part and parcel of the whole design of the Riviera Plan, which Donald Trump and various Israelis have been pushing. So I think it's time for the world as a whole to wake up. Firstly, to support and recognise Palestine. Secondly, withhold all arms supplies to Israel. USA could stop this tomorrow.
But as we've seen, and this has been part of the global frustration, I guess, because there is growing, global and in the US, even public opinion, which is, turning against the actions that Israel has embarked on. You've made some suggestions for what the UK should be doing. But by and large, the status quo remains, and more people are being killed every single day. So it seems as if our international mechanisms just can't stand up to this.
They're not capable of dealing with it at the moment. And the UN last week was interesting in the sense that Israel has never been more isolated in world opinion than it was last week during the UN session. But the bombardment continues. And then there is this sort of rather strange debate that goes on, with everybody except Palestine being involved in the debate about what the future form of governance would be in Gaza and the West Bank. That seems to me a sort of colonial mentality. And this word around that Tony Blair is going to be appointed a sort of governor of Gaza. No, what we need is the occupying forces out and the people of Palestine, who are very resourceful, very capable, being given the opportunity to rebuild their own society.
Well, Tony Blair, as you've just said, is being reportedly lined up to head what's called the Gaza International Transitional Authority. This is GITA. It's a temporary administration to govern Gaza after the war, before control would be given back to the Palestinians. But there is, and you talked about the Chilcot report a little bit earlier in our conversation, and Tony Blair was very much part of that whole theatre, so to speak. So, given his controversial legacy related to the Iraq War, you've shared in part your view on his part in all of this, but again, how should other states be viewing this? And can he be credibly put forward for a potential role like this?
Tony Blair should be nowhere near any of this. It's not his business. It's not his skill set. It's not his knowledge. He has questions to answer about Iraq. A lot of questions to answer about Iraq. He also has made a phenomenal amount of money since he ceased to be Prime Minister from various international dealings. And so why would Blair be appointed to run a transitional authority in Gaza? I think it's a question for the Palestinian people. Surely the priority is to get the occupying forces out, get the UN Relief and Works Agency able to deliver the food and medicine, which it's quite capable of doing, and then develop a process that the Palestinian people can decide their own future. I just fear the idea that Blair or somebody like Blair will be appointed to run Gaza, and it will be yet another occupying force against the wishes of the Palestinian people.
You have, Jeremy, faced accusations of anti-Semitism related to your pro-Palestinian activism and some of the views you've been sharing with us here. How do you separate anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism and address some of the criticisms around that?
It's very important to separate them. They are totally different issues. Zionism is ultra-Zionism is what the Israeli government is pursuing, the Greater Israel Plan. We have a right to take over anywhere. That is a sort of ultra-Zionist project. Anti-Semitism is an evil racist ideology of attacking people because they're Jewish. That is what happened before the Second World War in Europe. It's what happened before the First World War in Russia and other countries. It's what many Jewish people have suffered over many years. And so I have always opposed anti-Semitism in any form whatsoever. But it's important to separate out the concept of Zionism from anti-Semitism.
Talk to us about how you see things playing out in the short to medium term in the Palestinian territories, and how you see in any way a breakthrough in what seems to be a stalemate in the way that the world is engaging this, particularly with Israel and the US on the one side.
There is, in a sense, a stalemate. Now, what we have is obviously the bombardment in Gaza. Now, maybe there's going to be a ceasefire, maybe there'll be an agreement on that, and maybe aid will get in, and there will then be some relief for the Palestinian people. But they're going to need an awful lot of help and support, particularly financial help to help with the reconstruction. But the West Bank, where Israel has this ambition to annex the West Bank, and indeed that the Knesset on a non-binding motion did vote for that, that would obviously be completely wrong. Interestingly, Trump came out against that. But in reality, the annexation and occupation of the West Bank is going on. This massive settlement policy all over the West Bank, with huge settlements being built, which are protected by the IDF, is actually part of that annexation. And so there has to be a determination that the occupation will end and the annexation will end. Now, it might be hard for people around the world to understand that in reality, anyone in Palestine in middle age or even older has never known anything other than army checkpoints just to move around. This has gone on for decades and decades. The Palestinian people need to be allowed to live, and they're not by the occupation. The rest of the world needs to take more action, and that means sanctions against Israel that actually mean something, particularly the supply of arms. Now, Trump seems to change his position quite often, as we observe, but essentially it's the US support for Israel militarily that is the key to all this. Britain is a secondary part in it, but a very important secondary part in this. And we're working very hard to get Britain away from that position.